Great news. We're pretty much done with error handling. Now, we will add few small things later, but they will be minor. So congrats if you're still awake and eager to continue. And one tiny thing I want to mention though before we start hashing the passwords in the error handler middleware, instead of logging the message, I'm going to go with entire error just so I can see in the console if there is an error. And then let's keep on scrolling. I'll remove this line of code. At this point, it's useless. Or essentially, if there is an error, I will send back the default error and the message property, which of course is coming from this object over here. And now let's start hashing the password. So I'll open up the README because we have quite a few steps over here. And then let's just take a look at our problem, where at the moment, yep, life is great. We have our collection for users. We're saving the users every time the proper values are provided. But I mean, this is unacceptable. You never, ever, ever want to save passwords as strings, because if your database gets compromised, then attacker pretty much gets all the values. And not only that, usually the users use the same password for everything. So a better approach is actually to hash our passwords. So before we save it in the database, we hash them. Now, one thing we need to remember, hashing is a one-way street. That's it. Once you hash it, it's not like you can unhash it. You can only compare hashed values, which we're going to do when we log in. So when we register, we hash the password, we save it in a database, and then when the user is trying to log in, then we just compare the hashed values. And in order to set it up, we'll use this library, bcrypt.js. Again, this is very, very important. It is bcrypt.js, not just bcrypt. But before we start setting everything up, I actually want to go over the Mongoose Middleware, because this is the place where we will hash the password. And here I did leave a link. So if you want to follow the link, just click on it and you'll navigate here, and we can clearly read that Mongoose has a middleware. It's also called pre and post hooks. And you can think of this as a way for us to do something before or after we save the document. And we have a bunch of options over here. As you can see here, we have validate, save, and I'm not going to read all of them. And the code is going to look something like this, where we have the schema. In our case, that is going to be the user schema. And then in this example, they go with pre and then save. So we will do some functionality before we save the document. In our case, hashing the password. And then the second argument here is the function. So we pass in the callback function. And here, it's important that we use the good old function keyword, because inside of the function body, we'll use this to target document created by our schema. In our case, user schema, so our user document. And if you'll use arrow function, it's not going to work. And then there's also a next, which we pass on to the next middleware. So just like with express middlewares, we want to pass it on to the next middleware. Otherwise, basically, we'll just get stuck over here. Now, there is a tiny exception where in Mongoose 5, instead of calling next manually, you can use a function that returns a promise, basically a sync await, which is actually going to be our case, because the library that we're going to use, the bcrypt.js, and yes, I'm going to be annoying, keep repeating the JS, otherwise someone might install the other library and then the functionality is not going to work. But back to my point, in the library, the functions we're going to use are async anyway. So eventually this function will be async, but I just want to showcase how the next is going to work. And also, before we start setting up everything in the user schema, I do want to mention that when it comes to register, yes, it's going to be a little bit annoying, where at least in my case, I'll keep on removing the users. So that way I can just keep on using the John. I don't want to add 20 users and then each and every time I want to register user, I need to come up with those unique values. Not a big deal, but in my case, I always just prefer removing. Keep in mind that it is only for registering, and then once we start setting up rest of the functionality, it's not going to be the case. So what do we want to do now? Well, we want to, well, in my case, what I want is pretty much to remove all the tabs here, close everything, and then I'm going to be looking for the model user. And in here, we want to scroll all the way to the bottom. And then in order to set up the middleware, we're going to go with user schema, then pre, so before, and in our case, we're going to go with save. So before we save the document, we want to run some kind of functionality. And again, you have bunch of options over here, and I'm not going to cover each and every one of them. But one important thing that I do want to mention that this will get triggered in our case in two instances. So in the auth controller, notice over here how we create the user using dot create. And then later in the update user, what we're going to do, we're going to create this user instance. Again, at the moment, probably won't make sense, but eventually we will create that user instance. And then we can always use dot save. And if that's the case, we'll also trigger that hook, that middleware. But if, for example, you go here with user and then find one and update, that is not going to trigger the hook. And this is very, very important part because knowing this will help you avoid chasing a bug that actually doesn't exist. So again, very, very important. Yes, this is a hook that gets called before we save the document, but not every method is going to trigger it. And again, I'll talk about this once we get to update user, but this is something that I wanted to mention right from the get-go. So let's save this one, and then back in the user, what do we want to do? We want to pass in the callback function. And again, we want to go with good old function here. So the function with the function keyword. And for time being, here's what I want to do. I want to go with log, and let's just log this dot and then password. And a quick update, as you'll see in a second, it looks like, at least in my case, the request is being passed on to the next middleware anyway, basically without calling next. But if it's not the case in your setup, remember about the next parameter and the fact that you need to invoke it. With that said, in the next video, we will make this function async anyway. And at that point, like they mentioned in the docs, it will work regardless. So let me navigate back to my postman. And yep, in this case, I'm going to go with John. And I just want to see whether I'm getting back that value. And as you can see, I am. So I get back to John over here. And then when it comes to the console, I can clearly see the secret. And once we know how the middleware works, now let's implement hash password functionality.